Hey man, how would you gauge our Aux fuel install so far on the Mazdaspeed 3? Mazdaspeed 3, sorry.
Well, start that again.
Hey man, how would you gauge our Mazdaspeed 3 auxiliary fuel installation so far?
Well, this is how I would gauge it. This is a fuel pressure gauge from AEM. We've also got an oil pressure gauge and an AEM air to fuel ratio failsafe. Remember, like I said, this is a slow process. You can see the fuel rail here and the fuel lines and the cold piping. The car still runs, but the injectors aren't turned on yet because we haven't installed the split second controller or the gauges. But once we install the gauges, we're taking it step by step. We're gonna do gauges, then we're gonna do split second controller, then we're gonna tune it, and we're gonna take you guys along for the ride. So
there's actually fuel running through here going straight to his high pressure fuel pump that just isn't making it through those injectors because we didn't get time to wire it yet. But it's coming together. Look, see, look, transducer for the fuel rail pressure, low pressure.
This is the
go through.
This is for the fuel pressure gauge from AEM.
We'll put that in right now. Just plug it through. Route the wires into the cabin through the passenger side glove box compartment into that little 3-pod thing, which is from. Where'd you buy it from? What is it? What's the company?
CPE triple
they make
dash gauge pod.
Okay.
No, triple pod gauge. No, triple pod dash gauge. CPE triple pod. I don't know, man.
Okay, getting a bit serious now.
Yeah, so the reason why we have a fuel pressure gauge in the equation here is because we want to make sure that we have consistent low side fuel pressure feeding these two 1000cc injectors here, as well as the high pressure fuel pump. We want to make sure that the in-tank fuel pump, which we've upgraded to a DW300C, is in good working condition. It doesn't fail on us, and we'll be able to catch any signs of low pressure beforehand before we have any lean mixtures rather. And even though if there is a potential for lean mixtures, we're still going to have the AEM AFR Failsafe installed, so that if it detects a lean mixture, it triggers the Guardian Angel, which will then dump the boost. So with any auxiliary fuel injection system, it's always a good idea to have a failsafe in place because you want your car to last.
Yeah, and you know what? If he throws a rod through the pan and loses all his oil, we're also putting in an oil gauge today, so it'll see his pressure drop.
Exactly. So we're also going to make sure that the oil pressure is good before we do a pull. You know, you're chilling, you're ready to do a pull. You're like, all right, my oil pressure looks good. Let's do this. Bam.
So the AEM Failsafe also works as a boost gauge, which is good.
You know, you have one gauge displaying boost and air to fuel ratio, but the more important thing is actually the air to fuel ratio. The only reason why it needs that boost signal going to the gauge is so that it knows at what boost pressure to start monitoring the air to fuel ratio, because you can program the gauge right on your computer. So as you can see, we've got all the cold side plumbing completed. We've got our auxiliary fuel rail installed. We've got our 1000cc injectors installed. We've also got our fuel gauge pressure transducer installed, just so we don't have any leaks while we're running.
So the next thing to do after our whole cold side is done and all the fuel rail for the low pressure side is routed is to monitor all this using gauges. So there's a 3-pod shroud basically from CPE that Eric ordered, and we're going to put that in and we're going to populate it with a fuel pressure gauge for the low pressure line. You can see the transducer right here, an oil pressure gauge to monitor oil pressure, and that'll be tapped into a sandwich plate that we'll be installing. And last but certainly not least is the failsafe, the thing that's going to protect everything and send a signal to this Guardian Angel to basically dump boost if something goes wrong. That is an AFR meter, which will be triggered when we go above or below a certain air to fuel mixture, which also doubles as a boost gauge because it needs a boost reference anyway to kind of know what's going on.
It's called the CPE triple gauge dash pod.
That's it. That's the one.
So we decided to put the fuel pressure transducer right here, simply because there's more room on this side. I don't really think it matters whether you put it on this side of the rail or that side of the rail, whether it be before the injectors, the 1000cc injectors, or after the 1000cc injectors. I can't speak right now. I'm a little tipsy. Don't worry about it. We're here to have a good time. But that's why we put it on this side, because there's more space.
Yep, so now we're going to run our electrical lines from the pressure transducer all the way into the cabin where we put the watt box harness, because there's a really great access grommet right there into the glove box, and that'll go right to our gauge cluster pod.
Okay, so it's the next day, obviously, because we got lazy last night, but this is the fuel pressure gauge. This is the main bezel, and it's 52.5 millimeters in diameter, if I'm not mistaken. And this is the CPE triple gauge dash pod. And you have to file these holes out a little bit and sand them down, which is completely fine. And these just fit in nice and snug, right? You push it in, it clicks in. But yeah, it's gonna look pretty cool. That's only one gauge. So right now we're gonna get access. We're gonna remove this OEM piece on the dash right there, and then we're gonna run our wiring once we have some access. All right, so I just popped this piece off. Be very careful. There's one here, a couple tabs, just put that to the side. Now we have these two Phillips screws here, which we are going to loosen. I'm gonna use a flathead, which doesn't fit, so I'm gonna have to get myself a Phillips screwdriver. 1 second. I think this is pretty easy, actually, because if you look at the CPE one, it shows 2 screw holes right here, right? And then the rest is just clips, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So I think we're just transferring the clips over from the OEM one and putting them on this one, and then the screws we can reuse here. Take the screws out. Don't drop them, unless you want rattles. This is the first step to more power. Being able to monitor things effectively. Okay. Now we're going to disconnect the four-way switch, four-way flasher switch. And now I think we're going to have to transfer over the vents to this one. It looks like there's 6 Phillips screws. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we're going to transfer over the four-way flasher switch as well. So the 4 ways are going to go like this. Okay. Oh yeah, that's perfect. And I don't think they're pre-threaded either. We're self-tapping on this one. But it looks like we got our 4-way switch, the vents are back on, and the gauges are gonna come through these holes, and the wiring is gonna be going, in our case, we're gonna have the wiring come over to the right, below the glove box, through that access grommet that we tapped into for the watt box. This is the harness for the fuel pressure gauge. Running the wire harness through here. It's gonna plug into the pressure transducer. I'm gonna zip tie it to this coolant line here and just kind of tuck it away as best as possible. And then it's gonna run along the side. It's gonna run along here, gonna sneak through here. It's gonna go in through that same access point. We might have to extend this wire though. Cut these 3 wires and add some length to them. We'll determine how much we need to do once we start running this a little bit more. I'm gonna sneak the harness underneath the coolant reservoir and power steering reservoir. Keep it clean, 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 keeping 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 it.
Drop the f***ing cable, man.
There's 3 wires here, so we've cut 3 wires of the same length just to give the harness a little bit more length so we can reach the actual gauge underneath in the CPE dash pod there. We're just gonna solder them together just to give it some of that extension. Okay, so guys, this is our little extension that we've done here. Heat shrink, soldered, tape it up to make it easier to fish through the firewall there. Go. Hang on, slow down.
Yeah.
You go. All right, so here we have what you would call an out-of-fuse, or what do they call it? A fuse divider.
Fuse tap or something?
Fuse tap, yeah. Let's call it a fuse tap. And what we're gonna do is we found a 30 amp fuse right behind the glove box there that is getting power with the ignition turned on, which is what we want. So we're gonna use this, we're gonna plug that in, and then we're gonna put the 30 amp fuse here, and then the additional fuse for our added gauges, there's gonna be another fuse up here, and we've decided to go with a 15 amp fuse on that one. So went and bought some 15 amp mini fuses, and we'll show you how to do that right now. The battery should be disconnected. What we did was, we determined which fuse we wanted to tap off of, and we decided to go with one of the 30 amp fuses because a 30 amp circuit should be able to handle quite a bit, just in case. Yeah, we went off the one of the window circuits, the glass circuits, the motor circuits. and it turns on with the ignition turned on. So we have power with the ignition on, which will allow the gauges to be illuminated and functioning with the ignition turned on. This is one of the green fuses, one of the 30 amp fuses that we're going to tap into. Basically, this thing plugs into where the fuse goes, and then you put the fuse that was in its place here, and then you add another fuse on top of it, and then power will come out in parallel to the gauges. So,
and you need to get that from a local electronics store because it doesn't come with that, basically.
Yeah, so this is a lot of custom stuff, but we're just doing it. I'm gonna disconnect these connectors. I'm gonna try not to break these connectors here. All right, so now we got a lot of room here to work with. I'm gonna take one of these 30 amp fuses out. Ooh. I'm gonna take the out of fuse. I'm gonna put that 30 amp right here. There we go. That's the new path it's gonna take. So now we're gonna add one right here, 15 amp, just like that. And then this is gonna send power to the gauges, but we've decided that we're going to fuse each gauge separately. So I'll show you how we're gonna do that right now.
So the gauges are all fused together with that 15 amp, and then we're gonna add series fuses between each of the 3 gauges as well. So if one of those gauges malfunctions, a lower 5 amp fuse directly in series with it will take out that line so that the other 2 gauges will still be powered up.
This is a little fuse block that we bought from an electrical parts store. So what we're gonna do is, these are designed for small glass fuses. We couldn't find one designed for mini fuses. So what we're gonna do is, power from that out of fuse is gonna come into here, and then it's gonna splice off here and here. This one's just gonna be free. So we're gonna have power going in here, here, and here, and then power to the fuel pressure gauge is gonna go from here out to the gauge. This one's for the oil pressure gauge, and this one's for the AEM AFR Failsafe. So that's how it's gonna work for power. It's a little project box that we bought, and we're gonna put that little fuse block that we showed you there inside here. It comes with 4 screws, so you can remove the cap. The little fuse block is gonna sit inside like this. We'll use some Velcro tape to keep this in place inside here. The power's gonna come in, we're gonna drill a hole, and then we're gonna have a couple other holes coming out. And the whole point of this is to keep the fuse block safe and secure and prevent the possibility for any shorts happening. So we'll do it in steps. We'll start by drilling the holes on each side. In between the 2 pins, there was a piece of plastic that came all the way down, and it was basically preventing us from actually plugging it in. So we had to nibble that out with some tweezers or some small little wire cutters just to make some space there in the center so we could pop it into the fuse box. So now we gotta
16 gauge wire.
We gotta take some 16 gauge wire and we gotta crimp it into this section here.
Or we can just cut it and solder it.
Yeah,
proper connection.
Yeah.
This is just cheap electronic supply store butt connector. You can even see it's just, they just give it to you for ease of use, just so you can crimp something in, but we're gonna make a solid connection here.
Yeah, and then we'll run that wire to our little box there for the fuse block, which is
and that will supply the makeshift fuse block, which will then fuse individually the 3 gauges.
Is this what we got so far? As you can see, the power comes in and it goes to each one of these 3 power sources. 1 power going out to each gauge.
There you go. So now,
how is it?
Not too shabby. Let's drill our other 3 holes here. There we go.
Power's coming in. Splices off to 3 fuses, and then each fuse is sending power to their own gauge. My vocab's not that great right now. I work with my hands.
I work with my hand.
What?
What? Huh? 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 How it's made. 500 horsepower edition. You know what sucks? Soldering on a coolant overflow tank. I'm gonna manhandle it. We put some Velcro on here. Good old Velcro tape. Good old thick gauge. Even though it's not that thick. frozen solid PCV insulated wiring. PVC? PCV? Dude, you just farted nastily, man. Is it gonna smell?
Probably. Station it centered. There we go, guys. Power comes in from the fuse tap right here. We're gonna solder this to this, like that. I'm just gonna plug into the fuse box. 15 amp fuse right there, providing power to 3 6-amp fuses. So we couldn't find any 5-amp ones, but that's okay. And yeah, it's gonna be AFR Failsafe, fuel pressure gauge, and then oil pressure gauge powers. This,
Fuel gauge.
To the fuel gauge. Okay, so here we have a white wire, a blue wire, a red wire, and a black wire. The instructions say that if you're only using the gauge, you only need to wire up the red and the black, power and ground. These other two are for other reasons that I am not completely aware of, but the instructions say disregard these, don't worry about it. So we'll just disregard these and just use these. So basically what's gonna happen here is on this black wire, we're going to solder an eyelet to it, and then we're gonna screw it into this ground right here, right? And then the red wire, we're going to connect to one of these power wires here off of this little fuse box that we made. So we're gonna have to figure out exactly how to run that. So first thing first is we're gonna get our fuel gauge, fuel pressure gauge, and we're going to install it into the CPE triple gauge dash pod. We're going to have failsafe, fuel pressure, oil pressure. So I'm going to put this one right here. There we go. You can rotate a little bit here and there. That's good. Look at that. Looks pretty cool.
It's gonna be good, man. I'll be able to monitor everything.
We'll make final adjustments later. We're going to take our... I'll put this on after. Little bracketry. Okay, so now we're going to run the wire, this wire, through a little access point right here. It's kind of hard to get in there, but we'll make it work. Want to make sure you find a path where the glove box isn't going to get in the way.
Now are all of the plugs the same for all 3 gauges?
I'm pretty sure.
So maybe we should label it with some masking tape, because we're going to run all 3 before we plug everything in. My English teacher thought I was dumb. Okay, we're removing one of the extra bungs on the downpipe, and that's where our O2 sensor for the AFR Failsafe, AEM Failsafe is going to go.
Look at this, guys. Let's thread this AFR O2 sensor in. Let's thread in this O2 sensor. Thread has commenced. And as you can see, the wire itself is pretty close to one of the runners there. I'm gonna have to zip tie it. Okay, a little more. See if we can go a little more. Doesn't have to be super tight. That should be all right. I don't think it's gonna come out. So we got the instructions for the AFR Failsafe. They're pretty in-depth, and there's a lot of cool options. There's a lot of wires. Like if you look at this wiring harness, it's pretty thick. There's a lot of wires. It's kind of intimidating. This is the wiring harness that goes to the O2 sensor and then connects to the back. It's actually got quite a few options, but in our scenario, we're only going to be using the red for power, the red wire for power, the black wire for ground, and the blue wire for the external ground trigger for the Guardian Angel if it detects a lean out of fuel ratio. So that's all we really need. And it comes with the USB stick, sorry, the USB cable, and we're gonna be able to program it through our laptop. So you can actually change the faceplates here. It comes with quite a few faceplates. I decided to go with the one that's going to show the air to fuel ratio in the actual digital display, and the boost is gonna be displayed along the, I guess you could say, the circumference of it. So it goes from -30 vacuum all the way up to 30 PSI, and who knows how much PSI I'm gonna run with this Aux Fuel setup, we'll see. And then you basically program on your laptop which faceplate you have and it'll adjust accordingly. See the little boost tap here on the back of the AEM AFR Failsafe? We're just gonna, this is basically where the boost, it's gonna get its boost signal from. It comes with interchangeable bezels too, but I'm gonna keep everything black. I like it nice and dark.
Okay, so the O2 sensor is pulled through. O2 sensor cable, the one that connects into the AFR AEM Failsafe.
Yeah, it was easier to go from the under the hood into the cabin because trying to fit the actual O2 sensor connector right here through the hole is just too much. It's just too big. So we decided to go from small end through.
From here in.
So they give you a lot of length here, which is nice, but a little too much.
We're just gonna coil it up, zip tie it, and tuck it in there nicely somewhere.
So once what I'll do is figure out exactly how much I need, sort of. And we'll coil it up. Can't wait to turn the boost up. Safely. I don't want to cause any problems here. I'm gonna follow the same path that I did with the fuel pressure gauge harness.
The power and ground of this loom are going to be wired in our little makeshift fuse box and then grounded to the chassis here very well with the eyelets. All the other cables are analog outputs for like a data logger or something like that.
All right, so the wires that we're not using, we decided to go ahead and put some heat shrink on the tips so we don't have any issues with them touching and causing an electrical contact and any shorting happening.
Now it's impossible for them to actually touch each other.
We got our red, black, and blue wires completely separated from the pack. We've rolled up this bundle of wires that we do not need. We heat shrink the tips to make sure they don't touch. Everything is organized. This is the connector that's going to plug into the AFR gauge. And this is the USB that I believe we're going to have to run through the glove box in order to program the AFR gauge. So that's good. We're good. We're on the right track here. I want to make sure everything's clean and organized here. So right now it's just a bit of a mess.
You just want to lob that all off, and then if you need it, just extend it with wires.
Yeah, I mean this extra wiring here is just getting in the way. What if we just cut it right here?
Chop it off and we can rejoin it after. It's no biggie.
Yeah, let's cut it right here.
We're never going to use that wiring anyway.
I know, we're just using it for the failsafe.
And then we'll heat shrink the ends again, just so nothing shorts, but we're just going to cut this whole thing shorter. Okay, so here's what we got here. Blue wire is our ground trigger. So when the AEM failsafe reads a lean mixture, we are going to have this send a signal. And the thing is, there's a very long wire there, and there's also a very long trigger input to the Guardian Angel, which also happens to be blue. Look at that. So we're gonna meet them kind of in the middle, or just pass this directly through the firewall.
I think we might be able to use just the Guardian Angel one potentially, but if not, we'll use the other one. But we're gonna run this in behind the battery, keep it nice and neat. We might even use the watt box loom, the shielding that we have, and stick it in there as well. Keep it nice and stealth. Tuck it into that wire wrap.
Tuck it in. So this blue wire has to connect to the failsafe blue wire, and then everything will be okay.
Okay. Put that there. Let's get this off.
Okay, so we decided we're just going to take the engine out to help get the wires from here to here. It's just a lot easier.
The engine?
The exhaust manifold is in the way, and instead of dropping the exhaust manifold and the turbo to get the wire through, we're just going to take the whole block out. We're just going to take the front clip out first. We're going to vent all of the AC gas into the atmosphere, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, we don't have a machine.
I want to see you at like 50 years old with the same facial hair, man. That'd be sick. It's like, that's the Eric. That's just the look. This right here is the Eric. He's had that same setup for 8 years now. Literally, it hasn't changed.
Because I can't grow hair.
No, it's good, man. It's cool. I like the soul patch is cool, man. I had one for a while in high school, but I could never get the density between the lip and the chin.
The density of the facial hair is not included in this program. Now we have access to run the wire, the blue wire.
That loom over there we made for the watt box, and it's routed behind the brake fluid reservoir, and we're gonna try and put this blue wire in that loom. You could technically just run the whole wire across the back and into the access grommet, but it's good to protect it. We bought that from an electronic supply shop. It's just, it's called like wire wrap. All it is just a plastic loom. That's the best thing about a split loom too. You don't have to fish anything, just push it in. All right, so let's just run that across behind that shield there.
Got a lot of wires coming through the firewall here. Okay, so this harness here, it's for the watt box. This blue wire is the trigger wire for the Guardian Angel. Harness full of green wires is for the fuel pressure gauge. And this one here is for the AEM AFR Failsafe. Now we're gonna have one more coming through here for the oil pressure gauge. So we've soldered the blue wire here. This is the blue wire coming off the AEM harness for the AFR Failsafe, and this is the, you can see our solder joint with heat shrink here, and this is the blue wire for the Guardian Angel. So we're gonna organize all this, make sure it's nice and clean, nothing's getting pinched, and we're gonna keep going.
So basically, any wires that we are not using, we are putting heat shrink on the individual wires, and then folding the heat shrink over the top of the wire, and then putting heat shrink over that, so that you end up with this little ball of love that cannot short with anything. Okay, so the next step basically is to put the oil pressure gauge in. And to do that, we need to jack the car up, and we need to drain the oil, and then we're going to be installing a sandwich plate that goes between the oil and the oil filter housing, right? Okay, so the next step in the auxiliary fuel setup is to buy an engine that can naturally make more power on the stock fuel system. Looking good, not hitting anything yet. Keep on jacking.
Here's the sandwich plate adapter. It comes with 4 ports. This is Pro Sport. Yeah, Pro Sport sandwich plate adapter. And we are going to be plugging off 3 of the 4 holes with the plugs provided. We're gonna put some of that sealant on there, the thread sealant. We'll retrofit this onto the actual oil filter housing and figure out which port we want to use that gives us the most space for our pressure transducer. And then once we've determined that, then we'll put these in, the ones that we're not using, and then we'll be able to install it with this nut. So it just goes in, threads into the original housing, and then we'll just put the oil filter on. It's always good to put a little bit of oil on your oil filters and gaskets. So we're going to apply some thread sealant now to these plugs.
You know what, man, we're going Aux Fuel. What the hell is this doing here? It's empty.
So we got these sort of snug. Just the one we're going to use. What we're going to do is we're going to install this. We're going to tighten it down, and then we're going to try to tighten these.
That right there uses a 26. Well, it's 26 works basically.
Approximately 26. Yeah.
Probably isn't metric, but it fits.
So as you can see, this is the housing that we installed. We had to do this for the Gen 1, and we've removed the oil filter now. And this basically is going to sit like this. The catch can lines are in the way right here. So that's why we needed to use this part, because there's a bit of space right here. So we're going to just center it as best we can. Put our little retaining nut in, start threading it like so. It's a sandwich plate, right? So all it does is get sandwiched. It doesn't actually, there's no threads on the actual plate itself. It's just getting pinched in between that and the filter. Get it into the correct orientation here. When you tighten this thing down, the whole sandwich adapter spins, and that causes a problem because then it basically makes my hole that I wanted to go into inaccessible. Because when I tighten it, it bottoms out against the housing here. And this is the one to use.
So we're going to take that plug off, and that's where the pressure transducer is going to go. And that plug will go on the other option, the other hole, where we thought we were going to put the pressure transducer. Okay, so the trick is basically put it in very loosely, just like that. Enough so that you can still rotate it easily, like this. This is when you tighten the plugs, because otherwise it's kind of hard to get in there. I don't know how tight to go, but it has to be able to withstand about 80 psi. Let's make it happen, Captain. This is going to be good. It's going to be really good.
Okay guys, so we got the Pro Sport sandwich plate adapter installed. We're going to be mounting the sensor right here, because when you tighten this thing down, the whole thing spins clockwise. This plug ends up hitting the actual housing itself. And I was just using this as a counter hold, but I didn't go too tight. You don't really have to go too tight with this, right? So anyways, now we just got to put the oil filter on and the pressure transducer right there. Run the wire to inside the cabin, and we should be set. Okay, so as you can see, the pressure transducer is right there, threaded into the sandwich plate, and we've got our oil filter there. Now all we got to do is run the harness.
Okay, now let's top up the oil. And we can run the wire for the last gauge into the cabin, and we'll put the battery box and battery back in, and then we'll test the gauges, and then when all the gauges are working, we will wire the split-second controller for the Aux Fuel system. And after that, we're going to tune it for some boost and some fuel and some power.
Oh shit.
What's wrong?
This is funnel.
Pressure sensor's attached. There's the filter.
I'm gonna go back up top.
We just need to run this into the cabin, positive and negative, and then the analog signal, which we are not using. What's that?
Disorder now, somewhere between the sacred silence, okay. I love that song. It's a good song.
Zip ties. Anybody like zip ties?
Zip tie time? Okay.
Between the sacred silence and sleep.
Okay, so we ran out of length for the cabling provided for the oil pressure sensor, so we just extended it.
Just like the other one.
Yeah, just like the fuel gauge. Okay, so we just got the wiring through for the last gauge, the oil pressure gauge, and now we just put a boost line through for the AFR AEM Failsafe.
Okay, so that's like that. Take a look here. See what happens when I push this in. How tight is it? Oh, that's tight.
Oh, it's tight.
Yeah.
Oh, because they supplied it with it. Okay.
Yeah. Installing gauges, not the easiest thing to do. Kind of meticulous process. Yeah, it's easier to pull the gauge out, plug it in from here, then push the gauge in. I was not thinking straight now, was I?
The more you know.
Now we got to get some leeway on this. So there's these little white clips here on the original dash piece. Don't forget to transfer them over to the new piece. So one way to check to see to make sure nothing's pinching is obviously install it in a smooth, careful fashion, but you can grab all the wires and you just kind of like just go up and down. Nothing's pinching. You can hear movement up here.
Nothing's snagged, everything's good.
Nothing's snagged. So the top end is done here. We just got to put the screws in. And then what we're going to do is we're going to organize all these wires and then provide power, connecting them all to our little fuse box here and our out of fuse.
And then we'll ground our grounds right there.
Right there. So we've kind of taped up the wires a bit, just along here. I don't know if you can see that, but trying to just get everything organized. This is our power, USB.
So all that's left is basically the 12 volt and ground for each of the 3 gauges. So one side of that is going to go into the fuse panel, and then the 3 coming out with those inline fuses will go to each of the 3 gauge 12 volts.
Alright, just gonna pop this cover back on here. All our fuses are in there. There's our little makeshift fuse block. This actually I think can go in the glove box because this is the USB for tuning the failsafe. Decided to take all of our grounds and twist them together and then crimp them into one eyelet. And then we put some solder right on the tip there. Okay.
You are grounded.
So, for our boost source for the AFR failsafe, we've run our boost hose and we've teed in to this bypass valve hose, and we just bought a generic tee. Basically, it's going to tee in like that. So we're just going to cut this to size and then pop it in right there.
First test, let's go.
All right, so we're just going to turn the ignition on. We want to make sure there's power here and that they light up. So I'm going to turn the ignition on. Okay.
Oh, nice.
So they power up. Turn this off.
14.4 AFR.
What the hell is that? Maybe we gotta calibrate it?
What?
Oh no, it's calibrating itself. So the leanest it'll read is, it seems to be 18.
Start it up.
Why is that gauge jumping around like that?
Fuel pressure's probably going crazy. But you got a good AFR, and your oil pressure's 80 psi.
I gotta do some reading. Trying to figure out where we're gonna run this.
Split-second controller time. So this is what's actually going to be firing these auxiliary injectors based on the MAF sensor signal.
Okay, so this is the plug-and-play harness from Speed Performance, and it plugs into the this harness on the split-second controller. This is going to be plugged into the OEM harness. These connectors here, and then these ends right here on the actual plug-and-play harness are going to be plugged into the coils. So first step is to disconnect these disconnect all these, pull it aside, made it up to this harness, and then tuck it all away. Okay, so as you can see, guys, here's the plug and play harness. I've managed to get the OEM harness underneath the manifold and plug in each of the ignition coil connectors into the plug and play harness. And I've tried to make sure that they have enough slack and that the wires are not getting pinched or anything or rubbing on anything. One thing though is that I'm going to have to extend this connector for the high pressure fuel pump. It's only 2 wires. We're just going to extend it a little bit, as well as this small little ground eyelet here. Going to have to extend that so we can reattach it, probably about 1 inch. So where we are so far, got the ground all mocked up there. It's all tightened down. I'm gonna put the split second controller in here, like that. Gonna come around. It's gonna get powered up right here. Okay, we got power going in, and the rest. This is for the mass airflow sensor wire. As you can see, I'm about to solder it right now. It's teed into the middle wire, the voltage wire. The wire likes to melt. Just melted the whole wire. It's good, it's good, it's good. Perfect. Okay, so this is where we're at so far, guys. We got split second controller located right there. Got the wires coming down. Run them right there. Wrap them up because it's a large bundle. We tapped into the mass airflow sensor right there with the green wire on the split second controller harness, and it's the middle wire on the mass airflow sensor connection. So we tapped in right there on that voltage wire, and then we've got it coming around here to the 2 connectors for the 2 injectors. It's a batch fired system, so the harness had 4 connectors for 4 injectors, but I decided to just cut those off temporarily, and I can always resolder them back on if I ever decide to go with 4 injectors. But since it's batch fired, they all fire at the same time anyways. And then decided to move the OEM harness below the intake manifold. Connectors are still there. I had to extend the high pressure fuel pump connector and this ground cable right there in the middle. That needed to be extended, no problem. A little bit of solder does the trick, and some extra wire. And then basically this is the plug and play harness. The original harness goes underneath and then plugs into the plug and play harness. There's our boost source right there, the T fitting. And that's for the AEM AFR Failsafe. That basically runs all along there, around the side, into the cabin, into that access point right there. It's coming together, guys. It's coming together.
We'll be right back.